What's the most awkward situation you've ever been in? This poor girl walked into my lecture by mistake about halfway through. This particular professor really enjoys talking to all of his students and was super engaging even with 400+ students in his class. When the girl walked in, my professor stopped teaching, looked at the girl and asked if she was in the class. She said she was and began walking towards the front where the open seats were. This is a fairly large lecture hall and all 200 students, approximately how many actually show up to class, were now forced to watch this poor girl walk towards a seat because the professor didn't continue talking and just stared at her. She got close to the front and I think the pressure of the whole room got to her and she said, "Actually no, I'm not," and turned around and we all had to watch this poor girl climb back up the stairs and out of the hall. I was literally watching my worst nightmare. I did basically this. Went to an exam on the wrong day. Sat there while a few hundred exams were passed out. Okay, you may flip over your exam. Put my name and ID at the top. Look at first page dumbfounded by questions. Look at second. Same. 2 minutes into an exam I had every eye on me as I walked down to the front to turn in the test and tell them I was in the wrong place, then all the way to the back to leave. I've done worse though. When I was a kid, we were on holiday and decided to go to a church. While we were there I decided that I would be funny if I would slap my dad's ass with both hands. So I ran in full speed to maximize the impact of the slap. I ended up slapping a stranger who also happened to walk next to a woman with a stroller in his hands, which made me think it was my dad. It was even worse that my parents saw it as well. I once followed a man out of a grocery store, across a small parking lot, and tried to get into his car with him because I thought it was my dad. Didn't figure out my mistake until I saw him look across the top of the car at me trying to get into the passenger side with a super confused look on his face. Cue my actual dad running up breathlessly, waving his hands and yelling at me. When I was a kid my family's van broke down, so we all had to squeeze into my dad's car to go to a funeral. Anyways, my older sister had to sit on my lap. Yep, you guessed it. I got a and she freaked out and started screaming. I would just cut all contact with everyone and go live in the forest for the rest of my life. Had a good run. Pep pep, but I popped a with my sister on my lap. I guess life just isn't my thing. My 79-year-old mother-in-law with Alzheimer's telling us that she had had sex the previous night with another resident of her nursing home. She had been celibate for 20 years up until then, we think. Boss of mine worked in a retirement home. Apparently, they have a huge STD problem in those homes because why wear protection when your ovaries don't work? The bright side is if you're a virgin all you have to do is wait till you're old and decrepit, get put in a home, buy tons of Viagra, and get your game on. My mom was over social services for a long-term care facility. Residents of course have the right to have romantic relations with whomever they choose as long as the resident is deemed competent to give consent. So it was under my mom's duty to provide a special room for residents to use when they wanted to engage in a little rumpy-pumpy. One resident was HIV+ and had a romantic visitor one day. Obviously due to HIPAA laws no one could reveal the resident's status or try to find out if the visitor knew his status. Needless to say my mom said she paced around the front office with the director of nursing trying to figure out what the hell to do. She was a social worker for 40 years and she named that as the most awkward situation of her professional career. Last summer my wife and I were browsing for random crap in Pier 1. I'm wandering around the store aimlessly and see my wife kneeling down inspecting some merchandise on the bottom shelf. I approach her from behind, slightly tap the top of her head, and go boop. It was not my wife, just someone who looked almost exactly like her from the back. She looks up at me. All I managed to say was, "Oh, I thought I was married to you. Sorry." For some reason the fact that you said "I thought I was married to you" instead of the normal "I thought you were my wife" is infinitely hilarious to me. Not awkward for me, but I was the reason for it. I served for a couple years and worked multiple restaurants in that time frame. I worked at a Denny's, night shift. Best and worst job for many reasons. Anyways, there was a regular that came in often, drunk as a skunk and nasty as hell. He tipped really well but was so nasty to us girls. It never fazed me, so I served him often. He offered many times to pay for extra service and tried to get me to leave with him often. Of course I never did, but a couple months later, him working making a new place little more high-end. I worked mornings here, and this was a Sunday morning church rush. Guess who was sat in my section? My nasty regular from my last job with his entire family. His wife, kids, parents, the whole group, fresh out of church. The look on this man's face when I walked up and said hello, he was red as a fire truck. And I made it worse by asking if he remembered me. He left me a huge tip, probably because I didn't bring up his nasty mouth and grabby hands from his late drunken nights. I have a similar experience where a 50-plus-year-old man I was 19 would come in and order takeout maybe once or twice a month from a restaurant I used to work at. He'd say things about me to the male chef like I sure love a girl who's smarter than me, and constantly did everything he could to stand as close as possible to me, and he'd leave $20 tips on a $20 check. I usually worked days, and one time I was working a dinner shift. He came in with his wife and kids and he refused to make eye contact. I can't fathom why these people would decide to go to the places they terrorize with their family and friends. You'd think they'd know not to where they eat. My ex-wife later came out as a lesbian, and we divorced. Years later, I went to her wedding, where she married her now wife, which was one of my ex-girlfriends. This isn't an awkward situation. This is a sitcom I'd watch. I was at a funeral for one of my husband's relatives. On my way in, an employee of the funeral home asked me when I was due. I wasn't pregnant, but I am fat and was wearing an Empire waistcoat, so I wasn't offended. As I signed the guest book, I corrected her and tried to defuse the situation with a joke about burning that coat later, but she just wouldn't stop. She kept trying to apologize and explain herself, and I just wanted to run away. Then I was stuck in a small room with her for the next 2 hours. I have sort of an inverse story. When I was pregnant, I gained a lot of weight. One day while I was very pregnant, I was riding up an elevator and someone on the other side waved at me as they were coming down. I did not know them, but I'm friendly, so I waved back. They then realized their mistake and came up to explain. They said, "I'm sorry, you look like my wife," to which I cheerfully replied, "Oh, when is she due?" His wife wasn't pregnant. That's an oof if I've ever seen one. I was in some business college class and the professor was talking about something related to how celebrities brand themselves. Someone in the class brought up Shaun White as someone who had great celebrity branding but isn't really talked about a lot. The professor was Indian and said he wasn't familiar with who that was. So my genius app thought it would be perfect to say out loud, "I'm talking about Mountain Dew's baby," as a joke reference to that newscast where Shaun White said he had been drinking all night but was underage, and the news person asked him what he meant, so he responded with, "I'm talking about Mountain Dew's baby." And no one seemed to knew about that, or at least didn't think it was funny, as silence rang through the classroom and professor awkwardly moved on to a new topic. Truly the most awkward situation I've been in, and also the worst haunting moment of my life. I was looking at my mom's phone cause. She wanted to show me some pictures from what she did that weekend. I swiped one too many times and came across one of her nudes. I felt my soul jolt out of my body seeing that shit. My mom added me to her Google photo album, then forgot. You can guess the rest. I accidentally walked in on my grandmother while she was nude and turned around so quickly to run I broke my toe on the door jamb. I screamed, "Sorry grandma," while limping away. Then I heard her cackling at me. I dunno if this is really the most awkward, but it was def awkward. I visited my bio dad's old church in Mississippi a few years ago and spoke to his old preacher for a moment. One important detail for this story is that my dad died when I was 7, so a pretty good while back. My grandma told the preacher who I was. "This is Pomelo Sr.'s daughter, Pomelo." Preacher: "Oh, Pomelo Sr. Tell him I said hi for me." Me: "Sure thing." My grandma's face was priceless. We agreed the preacher would feel really awkward when he remembered later that my dad was dead. After my father had passed away, I was with my uncle, aunt, and her friend going to a restaurant. Somehow my father came up in discussion and her friend asked, "Oh, will he be meeting us?" And I replied, "If we make it there safely, no." I was a teenager with a pretty standard so far. I walked downstairs and had to tuck it in my pajamas so the head is sticking straight up and the erection is pinned against the body so the isn't noticeable. Well, when I put my t-shirt on, it fell behind the tip, so if you looked at my wasit line you could clearly see the tip of my I was talking to my mom for a few minutes and she was flushed red in the face and quickly trying to kill conversation, not something my mom is known for. I walked away. Saw what was going on and didn't know what the hell to do. We never discussed it, but because things were so awkward at dinner, I'm pretty sure my mom knew that I realized it happened as well. Ha. How embarrassing. I never have to worry about my being noticeable to anyone. Wait. So are you two dating? He said yes at the same time I said no, to which his friend told him, I told you you didn't ask clearly enough. Reminds me of the time I was driving a girl back from a date when we got in a car wreck, rolled the car and everything, dragged her out through the window as she's bawling. When we were talking to the cop he asked us how long we'd been together. She said we were just friends. Not that I didn't have it coming. Sir, we're going to have to write you a ticket. Your accident was caused by going too fast in a friend zone. My best friend waiting to tell her parents that she's gay until when I was over for dinner. How? I bet that was fun. Did you even get any forewarning? 0. In fact I didn't even have a clue she was. Surprise.